ladies and gentlemen, I have the not so rare, but let's face it, it's rare privilege of introducing the wonderful, talented, inimitable Brad Zinn. Brad, the floor is yours, my friend.
Well, thank you, Zach. I appreciate it very, very much. I'm always honored and glad to be here, part of Jack Benny Convention, because Laura and Walden, in particular, changed my life by introducing me to word track and literally. So for that, I owe them tremendous thanks. And Zach, you've been doing a phenomenal job of putting together. So I think I give you a great debt of gratitude. So,
well, thank you, Brad. By the way, you are breaking up a little bit there, so we.
Oh, okay. Well, I've got Wi-Fi and Verizon going at the same time, so hopefully that will clear up.
Okay.
Do we have Melissa in the room yet, or
We
not?
do. She's right here.
She's right there.
Spotlighted for everybody.
Let me jump right in. That's Robert. And Robert, we're going to get to you in just a short bit. But first, I'd like to introduce someone that I've just met recently. And excuse me, this is our George Burns panel. We're going to talk about the relationship of George Burns and Jack Benny, of course. And I'm wearing my George Burns tie. And I don't know if you can see this, but it's got the cigar and the microphone and the glasses. And then on the underneath side here, there's a quote, which I will read to you. It says, I don't believe in dying. It's been done before. I'm looking for a new exit. And so that's my tribute to George. Well, ladies and gentlemen, someone who spent 30 years with George after Gracie passed away is Melissa Miller, and she's with us now, and she's written a wonderful book. Do we have, Zach, do we have that photo of Melissa with George that we can show everyone? I don't know, maybe I threw him a curveball. Anyway, here's the wonderful book that she wrote called Close But No Cigar, My 30 Wonderful Years with George Burns. And by the way, I did look this up, Melissa, and it is still available if you want to get a copy. This is Amazon, I think, and it's hardcover, $23 if you want to order a copy on Amazon. So Melissa was George's, I don't want to mischaracterize this, but I will say companion for 30 years after Gracie passed away. And she got to know George, a different side of George. She got to know the offstage George, the personal side of George. And Melissa, we're honored, we're delighted and thrilled that you agreed to be with us here today. Let's start with the fact, well, let's just start with the basics. Where did you grow up and how did you get involved with performing? Because you were a performer when you met Jack or George.
I was. I grew up in Long Beach, California. And I'm a third generation Los Angelino. My grandparents were married in the late 1800s in downtown, or in early 1900s. Anyway, doesn't make any difference. And I started being in little theater when I was in junior high school. And I just always did it, performed in Long Beach, and I was in the Civic Light Opera in Long Beach. And I found that going to rehearsals at night was a good way to get away from home at night. So, and not do homework. So I did that throughout high school. And then I auditioned for a singing group that was the professional group of the Young Americans, the Up With People. And I started college. So I went on the road and we were the opening act for Mr. Burns, that I've always called GB, in Vegas. And he found out I could tap dance. And he heard me doing a time step out in the hall, and he came out and challenged me and said, time step, huh? And I knew who he was because I'd watched the Burns and Allen show as a little kid. And I remember they had a patchwork curtain at the end. I never thought the show was very funny, but I was a little kid. And I said, yeah. And he said, can you do this? And he showed me a traveling time step. And I said, yeah, I can do that. And I copied him because I could hear it. And then he found out I could play Maple Leaf Rag, that I could play ragtime, which my grandmother had taught me. And he said, well, can you do this? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, can you go out to dinner with me? I said, sure. Seemed okay to me. I was 18. And yeah, we went out for dinner and that was great. And he taught me how to gamble. We went to the casino and I learned how to play blackjack, and that was the beginning.
And let me ask you, because we've had a pre-interview, talked about this a little bit. Were you, when some people meet a celebrity, they're kind of starstruck and, and they're fans and all. I didn't get the sense that I don't want to put words in your mouth. No. Tell me, what was your reaction when you met George for the first time? Were you impressed or unimpressed, or how did you react to meeting him?
I was unimpressed. I've never been starstruck, unless it's someone who's won a Nobel Prize. Otherwise, celebrities put their pants on over their head like everybody else. I'm not impressed. I grew up here.
Okay. Well, how did you said the start of it was learning to play blackjack and the time step and all of that sort of thing. How did the relationship grow from there? What were the next steps?
Well, the Young Americans fired me because I was hanging out in the casino. I was 18 years old. I shouldn't have been in the casino. I'd never had any liquor to speak of. I had gin. I learned how to play blackjack with a single deck, and I was very good. And I was hanging out in the casino between shows, because it used to be in Vegas, you did an 8 o'clock show and a midnight show.
Right.
And people had a dinner show, and they also got very dressed up, unlike now. I haven't been to Vegas in decades.
I remember those days. I remember those days.
It was glamorous and people got dressed up. It was a big deal. And that's just the way I want to remember it. So they said, either you stop. So I would go out for dinner with GB almost every night after the show. Yeah, almost every night. And they said, either you stop hanging out at the casino. And I didn't drink in the casino. I didn't drink much at all. And gambling, or we're going to let you go. And I told GB that at dinner. I said, guess what happened? He blah, blah, blah. And he said, well, why don't you quit, kid? And I said, I've only got a year of college. Quit and do what? He said, come work for me and do the Burns and Allen's routines. And he had already pulled me out of the line on stage and had me sing with them, which didn't make me real popular with everyone else in the group.
I imagine not.
They all wanted to be standing next to him singing, and I didn't care. So I did. I quit. That was that. And I remember it was during the 6-day war in Israel. And I quit. And by the following November, I was on the Dean Martin show doing Burns and Allen with him in a soft shoe.
Do we, Zach, do we have that clip?
Oh, no.
I don't know if Zach's still with us or not.
What?
I'm here. Stand by for a second.
Still with us? You didn't know.
I died. It's very
Oh,
evident.
there's the photo. Okay.
That's what it sounded like. Oh, no.
He got his pictures back.
Right.
All right.
Okay.
Pictures on the broom.
Stand by for a second, guys.
Oh, there I am.
There she is.
Oh, wait, hold on here. Let me, I got to optimize for audio. Hold, please, for idiot with Zoom box. Okay. It is not letting me share sound either now. That's interesting. Stand by for a second. Brad, why don't you go ahead and ask another question here, and I'll cue you when I'm ready.
Sure. George, you just said that George pulled you out of the line to sing with you and also do some of the Gracie routines. Now, we just
Not until later. No, he only pulled me out of the line to sing at Vegas when I was with the group.
Right. But then later, he asked you to do some of the Gracie routines with him.
Yep.
And we just had a discussion a little bit about this. that Jack Benny had dressed up as Gracie and done the bit. And there was some, I won't say controversy, but there was some, whether that was going to be acceptable or not.
Oh, please.
But well, with Jack dressing up, but he also used Carol Channing and Connie Stevens at various times to do the Gracie routines. And then he asked you to also do the Gracie. And in your book, Close But No Cigar, you had indicated that you weren't prepared for the pushback that occurred from this. Can you speak to that? What was the reaction, and being as young as you were, apparently you weren't prepared for the reaction.
I don't remember what I wrote. Can you refresh my memory?
Oh, well, it was just that you weren't, that there was some criticism about it, and that you weren't really prepared. You didn't think that it would draw that kind of criticism.
Well, all I can tell you is I never shed a tear. Whatever they wrote, I never shed a tear. I don't know what they wrote. And they're all dead now anyway, so who cares?
Yeah.
But they're dead and I'm not, and I'm booked. I don't know. By the time I was on Dean Martin, I was 19. I don't know. I certainly wasn't Carol Channing, because she was a lot older and really nice. I spent time with her. I love Carol Channing. Other people did it. I didn't pay any attention. And if anyone said she's certainly no Gracie, that would have been water off a duck's back. That sort of thing, even at 19, didn't mean much to me. I don't know. Maybe I'm a tough cookie. I don't know.
Well, Brad, if we want to see how formidable Melissa is here on the Dean Martin show as she is here in this Zoom room, we're ready.
All right. You've got it ready. Let's roll it.
All right.
Yes, one of these days
You're gonna miss me, honey.
you're gonna miss me, baby.
Some of these days
Oh, some of these days
you're gonna feel so lonely.
you'll be feeling oh so
Miss
lonely.
my hugging.
You used to love it when I'd hug and squeeze
You'll
you.
miss my kissing.
You'd ask for more, and I tease
Miss
you.
me only
You want me only
when you're away.
when you're a
You'll
million.
feel so lonely.
In the evening when the sun goes
Just
down,
for me only.
I'll be on the other side of town.
'Cause you know, honey,
Oh, you know, baby,
that you had your way.
you went and had your own sweet
And
way.
when you leave
Comes
me,
tomorrow, set
you
tomorrow.
know it will grieve me.
You can bet you're gonna be full of sorrow.
You're gonna miss your blue-eyed baby some of these.
Easy now, I don't want to hurt myself. Yeah, this is show business. Miss your hug. Oh, miss my kissing. Dee-dee-doo. Dee-dee-doo-doo. Ah, we sit down and rest. Dee-dee-dee. Ba. Bum. Ba-doo-doo-doo-doo-da. Ba-da. Ba-da. Ba-dee-dee. Ba-dee-doo-dee-da. Say goodbye. Oh, wipe that tear from your eye. You're gonna miss your daddy.
You're gonna miss your little blue-eyed baby.
You're gonna miss your blue-eyed baby. Somebody. Vop, 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 vop. Miss your blue-eyed baby. Somebody.
And that's
right,
how it was done.
That was fabulous. That was absolutely fabulous. Just had a, excuse me, just had a question. And what were the Gracie routines, and what they were the old Burns and Allen routines that they did in vaudeville and on the TV show.
Yeah.
And George would bring them up with someone like Carol Channing or yourself or Connie Stevens and do them for the audience, the current audience, whatever. So that's what's meant by the Gracie routines. You were in pretty heady circles then with GB, going out to dinner and attending different functions with him. And you met a lot of different celebrities and stars. And as we said, you're not starstruck, but you did meet Jack Benny. And so I think we'd all love to hear your impressions of Jack and any stories that you might recall about Jack Benny.
Well, he was and he always will be Mr. Benny to me. I never called him Jack. He was always Mr. Benny. And I remember Mr. Benny as always being very elegant when we were always together, but we were always going out for dinner. So why wouldn't he have on a coat and tie? And usually he'd greet me by pulling me in for a smooch on the cheek, and he'd whisper in my ear, "Don't let him make me laugh." And GB would look at me and say, "What did he say to you, kid?" And I say, "Nothing." And it was always a lot of laughs. He knew that I played classical piano, so we'd talk about music because he plays violin. We'd talk a lot about music because he was such a talented violinist. And we'd go to Chasen's. We'd go out for dinner on Thursdays. I remember him coming. I remember being in New York and him coming to the 21. And by then I was maybe 5 years older. And as he leaned in, I said, "I'm not going to let him make you laugh." And that was it. So it was always, dinner at his house was always very elegant and very nice and very, very civilized and polite and calm and peaceful. And yeah, there were a lot of celebrities at the table, but I don't know. They didn't do much for me. I was sitting next to GB, and I knew as long as he was next to me, nothing would ever happen to me.
Did you ever make it to the Hillcrest Country Club? Did you ever make it there?
Yes, when I was at UCLA, I would go there because it's not that far from the campus. I didn't know anybody at UCLA, and I had classes. I had a lunch break. So, and I thought of that the other day. I was telling my son about it. I thought everybody could do this. I would drive over to Hillcrest to have lunch on my lunch break from UCLA. I didn't know. And I'd pull in just like I knew what I was doing, just like I had good sense. And I'd go in and they'd page GB. He'd leave his card game. He was always playing bridge. And he'd come and sit with me while I had lunch. And then I would sign for lunch and go back to my class. So I spent a lot of time, and we'd go to Hillcrest on Sundays because they had a great buffet. And GB loved the fact that I would try all sorts of different food. He loved that I would go through all the different kinds of herrings at the buffet, and I would try all the herrings. I went from schmaltz herring to matjes herring to pickled herring, creamed herring. He just loved that I would eat all kinds of herrings. We were at Hillcrest, and I played tennis at Hillcrest. I forgot that. Yeah, I played tennis at Hillcrest.
Did you ever hear, one of the famous stories that I'm going to say GB in deference to you're calling him GB. One of the most famous stories at Hillcrest is GB ordering sea bass and Groucho. Do you remember this?
You can see bass
every night. Can't see bass every night. You can't see bass at all.
Right.
And
when every time he ordered crack crab, Groucho would say, "Crack crab, here comes Charlie," because the real song was "Clap hands, here comes Charlie."
Oh,
Yep.
That's one I think that's new. I don't think we've heard that before.
It's not new. It's just you never heard it.
Yeah, well, I mean, new to us, yeah, because we never heard
I'm teasing. Yes. No, that was another one of them.
So in our pre-interview, we talked about you, and it's in the book as well, which I can't recommend enough. This is just an incredible, wonderful biography. I've read everything there is to read on George. and most everything there is on Jack, I think. And I have to, I know this sounds like I just because you're here, but the truth of the matter is, this is a really raw, intimate, no holds barred testament to your relationship with George Burns over 30 years. I don't think I've ever read an autobiography or a biography that was as really no, you don't pull any punches in this thing. This is really, I got a sense of how it was to be with him and your relationship with him over the years. I can't recommend this highly enough. It really was a revelation to me. Can you give us, well, I was going to say you went on tour with GB for many years. And one of the things that you said, either to me personally or in the book, was that you really enjoyed the time on the road because you got to be in the hotel and you had him all to yourself, so to speak. You didn't have to share him with the world. He was all yours while you were in the hotel. Can you speak to that just a little bit?
Well, that sounds a little racy. It wasn't quite as, it was just nice in the hotel because there was nobody else around. Usually we were doing 2 shows a night. It was in Vegas. Oh, that's not true. When we were working in London, we stayed at the Dorchester, and we had a beautiful suite with a sitting room in the middle and then a bedroom on either side, and it had a fireplace. And we were on the Max Bygrave show with Mr. Bygraves and one of my most favorite people of all, Jim Backus. And he was on the show. And I already knew Mr. Backus. He always wanted to hear, whenever I sat next to him at Edward G. Robinson's house, Jane and Eddie's house, he always wanted to know how UCLA was. He wanted to know what I was studying at school. And he was just great and funny and terrific. And he was on the show, and we had to go in the same car with the same car and driver out to the studio every day. And it was December. And so we had this room, a beautiful room. And when we come back, it snowed that winter, that December. And I went to Carnaby Street and I bought a sheepskin coat like the Beatles had. A sheepskin coat that had the fur was on the inside and the outside was the suede part. And I had the sheepskin sticking out the sleeves and around here. And it was
60s mod.
Exactly. And I certainly wasn't. I was going to UCLA and tap dancing in my spare time. And I got the coat and it stunk to high heaven. And because they cured those coats in urine, so they would last, and it was funky, man. And I remember it was snowing and we had this beautiful room, and GB said, "Kid, hang the coat out the window." What do you mean? What do you mean? He goes, "Come here." So we took the coat over to the window, and we're at the Dorchester looking down. And he hooked it somehow over the window ledge and let it hang out the window and close the window on the coat overnight. So to try and air it out. And, but that's the kind of stuff that went, and then we ordered room service, but the room smelled. And we rehearsed for the next day. And the next day we get in the car with the car and driver and Jim Backus. And I've got the coat on. I've got the new coat. I am the coolest thing around. Forget my trench coat. I've got the Beatles coat on, sheepskin coat. And we get in the car and the windows go up. And if I'm not mistaken, it was a Daimler. And what 20-year-old from Los Angeles had ever been in a Daimler? And as we drive out there, they've got the heat on in the car, and Jim Backus looks at me and he said, "You know what?" I said, "What?" He said, "You got to have that coat cleaned and burned." And I remember that made me laugh forever. I had that coat forever. But that's, when we were in a hotel room, it was nice. We'd watch TV. GB would have his dressing gown on. He always had a satin dressing gown. And it was real casual. I like hotel rooms. I've always liked hotel rooms.
One of the thing, and I think you mentioned this in the book, was that he took his toupee off. We all know he wore hair.
He did?
I know it's a revelation, but he would put it on the wig stand or the head or whatever. And what do you remember what he said?
Yes, of course. He'd put it on the block, as it was
The
called.
block.
Block. He put it on his block. And that was when he still had the toupee that had the webbing in the front, before he got the one that looked like the Frank Sinatra pixie cut toupee. He wore one that combed back and had webbing here that he used glue with. I remember he'd put it on, he'd pin it just perfectly. He'd say, kid, the block looks great, and I look like, and I won't tell you what he said, but it was not something that I'm going to repeat with other people listening. But the block looked great, and it had the pins in it, and it was all ready, and that was it. Most of the time in the house, he never had his hair on.
No.
No.
That was just for show. Well, is there any personal memory that you have of GB that might give us an insight into his personality that maybe we're not familiar with, or something that you think illuminates what he was really like deep down inside?
Something I think Robert will remember. GB had never had animals in the house, pets. He had a pair of Cocker Spaniels named Blarney and something years before, and the one Cocker Spaniel always bit the night watchman. So when I got there, I've always had cats, as you can tell by my sweater. And so we got cats. We got cats, and he liked cats. He realized he really liked cats. They were clean and they were smart. So through the years, we had a series of cats, and there was one cat in particularly liked named Ramona.
Yes.
And Robert, I see you nodding.
Yes.
And Ramona she was a Himalayan. She was a sweet, darling, beautiful kitty. I had her. And then when I moved to New York, I gave her back to GB and said, Ramona lives with you. And she was there, and I got married, and we came over, and we had my older son, who's 35 today, was in my arms. It was Father's Day. We went over for Father's Day, and we walked in, and GB was crying. Now, there were a couple movies we went to where he'd cry, and that was fine, but he was crying, and he said, kid, I got bad news. I thought, they'd lost his H&M trunk. I don't know, what's bad news in vaudeville? But he said, kid, Ramona died. His kitty had died, and he was sitting there crying, and he was in his 80s. And he loved that kitty. I don't think people knew how much he loved the kitties. I think, Robert, wasn't there a picture of him on like Life magazine? Or
Yes, I think that was with Willie.
That was with Willie.
That was with Willie on the little breakfast table.
Oh yeah, Willie was allowed on the table.
Yeah, he was allowed on the table. George had his coffee, and there was Willie spread out on the table with the LA Times sectioned out.
Yeah, perfectly. But the big Persian Willie was there, and
Yep.
Ramona would come up to the table
In fact,
when
they
we were
have that
having
picture.
dinner, and Daniel, who worked in the house, was serving dinner, would have to put an ashtray down. GB would put some chicken on the ashtray, and Ramona ate next to the table. I never thought it was odd. I don't know. Robert, what did you think?
No, I thought that was real normal.
Yeah. I don't think people realized that there was a real soft side to him. I think people saw him on stage with his collar and tie and his hair and his cigar and his timing, and figured that's what it was. But at home for dinner, with no hair and his silk dressing robe and the kitties and his leather slippers and knee-high socks,
Yes.
it was a mishpucha, as we say. It was family time. And I don't think people think of celebrities as having that soft underbelly when they're at home.
Did you ever see George do something that broke up Jack? Were you witness to one of those famous?
He told me about, it usually involved GB doing something to someone else that was really awful. And he'd tell Mr. Benny, wait till so-and-so comes in because here's what I just did to them. And he would always say, but if you laugh, it would be very rude. And GB would have done something, would have pranked someone about something. And then Mr. Benny would react and start laughing, not at what GB had done was so funny, but because it was made to make Mr. Benny laugh. So no, he was always very well behaved. He would say stuff to me in my ear when we were out in places to make me laugh. And then I looked like the village idiot. But I never saw him actually do anything to anybody and that would make Mr. Benny laugh.
Yeah.
I wasn't witness to it.
Yeah. Tell our time is running. You said you had a limited amount of time, and before we go, can you tell folks what you're doing now? I think it's fascinating. You're at Mount St. Mary.
I think you can see I'm in a classroom. Can you see that I'm in a classroom? I mean, there's a board behind me. I teach in a university. I'm a professor. I decided at 28 that I was better on paper than on stage. So I didn't have to become an aging blonde character actress with that could tap dance. So I went ahead and got a lot of college degrees. And as my son likes to say, Mom, don't get any more. You have more degrees than a thermometer. And I do. And I've been teaching and writing. I write. Oh, this is not unknown. I teach. I just finished. I dismissed class early. I was teaching a graduate humanities course today in Victorian novellas of mystery. So what, you know? And I've written a lot of articles in the last 10 years for the LA Times and Smooth Jazz Magazine, covering performers, jazz performers, covering performers at the Disney Concert Hall, Dave Brubeck, before he passed away. Next week, I'm going to go see, in my spare time, Bonnie Raitt at the Grammy Museum.
Yes.
And just, that's what I do. I think walking into a classroom in front of 30 students is a bit like being in show business.
Well, it has been said. It has been said. Absolutely. You found a niche, and it's obvious that it's done well for you, and I can see it in your face. I can
Thank you.
enjoy it in your face.
Thank you.
Well, we thank you so much for taking time, dismissing class early.
I can do it. I'm the professor.
And we're just delighted that you made time, and we're so willing to share your memories of George and Jack with us. We're blessed to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me and letting me reminisce with you. It was wonderful.
And remember, folks, it's pictured right here in the spotlight here. Close but no cigar.
That's back in 1976. Come on.
It's been lovely to hear from you, Melissa. Thank you so much for this wonderful treat.
I hope the rest of the day goes very well. Goodbye, Robert.
Hey, before you take off, I have one question for you.
Sure.
When did George start to wear, because he was already wearing them when I joined the group, the round glasses. When did that start? Somebody asked me that earlier today, and I had to be
God.
Oh, was it during Oh God?
When we were on stage, oh man, he wore contact lenses, hard contact lenses. He could barely get them in and out, and he was blind as a bat.
Yeah.
And
I remember how thick the reading glasses used to be.
Oh yeah. And then for Oh God, the original Oh God with John Denver, they gave him the round glasses, and it was so he became comfortable wearing his glasses when performing. He wore them off stage, but wearing them on stage, and they became a trademark.
Yeah, they did. They sure did.
Yeah. I can't think of God in any capacity without thinking of him as a gentleman wearing glasses and driving a car.
And let me jump in and say that Oh God was one of my favorite films. I was
too.
a little intrepid about seeing it the first time because I didn't know quite how they were going to play this. But the credit goes, I think, a great deal of the credit goes to Carl Reiner for his script. And I think Carl was brilliant in the way that they treated this. And they had reverence and respect. And I think George was cast perfectly in the role. But I loved Carl Reiner's script.
Yeah.
I did too. It had some wonderful sentiments in it. It was just, I've always loved that movie. I can't watch it very often. It makes me cry, but sometimes I cry at card tricks. You never know. You just never.
Well, I do that too. All right. Well,
Thank you, Lisa.
Melissa.
Love you.
Bye.
Thank you.
I'm
See
going to
you,
go
honey.
grade papers.
Okay.
See
All right. Love you. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. All right. So now moving on now to this gentleman whom I've had the pleasure of getting to know over the past years. Mark Kratzner said I transform into George when I see. I bought these glasses because they were round.
This is the new
why I
version of Kafka's The Metamorphosis.
There you go. I could hear this evening. At my age, I'm happy to be anywhere.
And,
Well, listen,
and
this-
Brad, you might want to get closer to the mic. That might help with the in and out, just to let you know. Yeah, there you
okay.
go.
All right.
Yep.
If I move in just a little bit closer here.
Yep.
Excuse me. Well, this gentleman I've had the honor and pleasure of knowing, getting to know over the past few years. He was George Burns's personal assistant for 20 years, starting in, I think, 1979, if my notes are correct. And he also is accessible on Facebook. I believe it's the official George Burns fan club on Facebook. There are a couple of George Burns pages, but I think Robert has the official George
Correct.
Burns.
And I got that cleared through the family.
Yeah, fan club. So there you go. So ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you now to Mr. Robert Howe, all the way from Detroit, Michigan. How you doing, Robert?
I'm good, Brad. How you doing?
I'm hanging tough, pal.
Yeah, I know you are. I know you are.
So you have your story with George is equally fascinating, I think, because you did something in 1978 or 79, whenever it was. I don't think you could get away with doing today.
No, probably not.
You walked right up to this man's door and knocked on the door. Can you tell us that story?
Sure.
Great.
Sure. I was dating a girl at the time, and she and her girlfriend were going to attend a show, a concert, whatever you want to call it, at the Roxy on Sunset. And
In Los Angeles.
in LA, in Hollywood, West Hollywood. And she didn't have anybody to drive her, so I said, I'll drive them. So I drove them. And I had no desire to see whatever it was they were seeing. And I thought, I'll just cruise around and just, it was nighttime. It always, Hollywood always had a different look at night. It was kind of like my dad used to say about paint, it hides a multitude of sin. And so nighttime in Hollywood, all the lights and everything would hide a lot of stuff. But anyway, I dropped them off, and suddenly, for some reason, it popped into my head that I knew where George lived, because I was a big, big fan of George's. I had been introduced to George through a set of records that my mother had bought my dad from the Longines Symphonette about the golden days of radio. In fact, Jack Benny narrated those records.
Yes.
And introduced them, and that's how I was introduced to Burns and Allen through that record set. So I was a fan of George's, and I had been a fan of the Sunshine Boys and Oh God, and I knew where he lived. I can't remember how. I might have been, I had his address from something. Anyway, so I found Maple Street, which was right off Sunset, drove down. It was pitch dark except for the lights. And I found the house. I parked across the street from the house. And I thought, well, I can't, it's too late at night. The house looked dark. I didn't want to go up then. So I fumbled around in my glove box, found something to write on, and I left him a note. Dear Mr. Burns, I'm Robert Howe, and big fan of Burns and Allen and Oh God, and wondered if I could get an autographed picture. And sincerely, Robert, And I thought, okay, now So I walk up to the house, which is, my mother taught me when I was very young, she says to use your elbows in a crowd. So I was using my elbows. I just walked up the walkway to the house. And in the front door, instead of just a peephole, it had a brass little door that you could open from the inside, and you could see who was on the other side of the door. Well, whoever had used it last didn't latch it, so it was cracked open. I just dropped my note down inside and drove away. 2 or 3 days later, I get home from work, and here's an envelope with George Burns' return address on it. It says, "Photo, do not bend." I open it up, and it's autographed to me from George. So I think, well, proper thing to do would be to thank him. So instead of writing a letter, I drove back to the house. It was early in the morning. And I parked again. This time I parked in front of the house. I swung around and parked in front. Sat there for a minute and then got up enough nerve to walk up to the front door. Had the envelope with me. I didn't want him to think it was just, some crazy person. And I knocked. And it seemed like forever. And then finally the door opens and this very large Belgian man is standing there. His name is Daniel. Lisa talked about him earlier. And Daniel and Arlette, they were a married couple that worked for George. And they worked for him for probably 25 years. Anyway, he says, "Can I help you?" I said, "Yes." I says, "Mr. Burns sent me an autographed photo, and I wondered if it would be possible to thank him for it." He said, "Well, just a minute." And he shut the door. I stood there. He opened the door again. He said, "Do you have the picture?" And I said, "Oh, yes, I do." And I handed him the whole envelope and everything. And he said, "Just a minute." And he shut the door. A couple minutes pass by. Door opens. He steps aside and he says, "Please come in." I thought, holy mackerel. So he takes me through the foyer and a little left turn, and boom. And there's George sitting at the breakfast table. And he says, "Come on in, kid." He's having coffee. He says, "Sit down." He says, "You want some coffee?" I'm going to turn down coffee with God? No. And we talked for a few minutes. And I told him how a big fan I was of his. And something must have clicked at that moment. I don't know what it was. Yes, Maxwell House, we hope. Right. Yes, Maxwell House coffee, we hope. And after he said, I gotta go to the office, and I left, and things started from there. And then he started working on Oh God 2, Oh God Book 2. And we're down at the train station, we're down at Union Station, and we reconnected. And then that's when it really started. And I began filling in at the office for Jack Langdon, who was George's personal assistant for 36 years. And I would then fill in when Jack would go on vacation. So it wasn't like I was there every day, every week, all those years. I was filling in when Jack was gone because I knew the routine in the office. Jack showed me I'd been there enough. And so that's how I came to meet him. And I don't know what it was to this day. Even my mother said to me, she says, "There must have been something that just happened between the two of you." And he liked me, and of course I liked him. And then he ceased to be, like Lisa said about not being starstruck. He was just George. And I too got to see the side of him at home, without the hair. And like she described, I loved it when she talked about the dressing gown and the knee-high socks and all that, and his martini, and he'd have the cigar. And probably one of my favorite times going to the house was I'd gone there from the office, and I can't remember why I had to go. I had to bring him something. Anyway, we're sitting there, and he's got the Dodger ball game on his big projection screen TV. We're sitting there, and he says, sit down, let's watch the game." So we're sitting down, we're watching the game, and finally he just looks over at me and says, "Isn't this better than having some guy spill beer down your neck?" I mean, that was his thought process. You go to the ball game, you're out in the crowd, people are in and out of the chairs, and some guy spills beer down your neck, when he's going by. And he said, isn't this much better than that? I said, absolutely.
Not to mention all the autograph hounds.
Not to mention all the autograph hounds.
Exactly. One of the
by the way, your shirt will be in the mail, by the way.
Oh,
see the shirt?
Oh, yes. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Sheila said not a problem.
Oh, that's fabulous. Thank you.
You're welcome.
That I forgot about it, actually. Excuse me. I forgot about it, but thank you. Speaking of beer and drinks and all that, one of George's lines was, I smoke 10 to 15 cigars a day and I drink 3 to 4 martinis a day. And a woman asked me if it's true I go out with young girls. I said, yes. She said, what does your doctor say? I said, he's dead.
That's right.
So you witnessed him smoking cigars and having several martinis. One of your stories that we talked about at one time was that George made you your first martini was with
my
George.
First and only. Hang on just a second here. Okay. Yes. Oh, yes. At the house one night, he said, how about you ever have a martini? I said, no. So let me fix you one. And he had a little bar there. Let's try to describe it. In fact, if you watch his video, The Wit and Wisdom of George Burns, all the interior stuff in that house, that's George's house, you'll see a bar. And it was in what I would call like the family room. That's where he sat in the evening to watch TV, and he'd have dinner at the table there that was set up. And then he'd have his drink, and he'd fix his own drinks. So he got up to fix this thing. And I have to tell you, it was like lighter fluid. I could barely drink it. It was just awful. And I didn't know how he liked these. How do you like these things? But he says, well, next time you can make your own. So from then on, anytime I was at the house, I'd just go around, I'd get a 7-Up or something like that. One and only martini. It was, you didn't want to light a match around it.
I was just about to say,
I was surprised
like that, and then lighting a cigar.
Lighting a cigar, poof,
Took a lot of courage.
Yeah, it did. It really did.
One of the stories that you and I talked about before, George was, and again, I don't want to put words in anybody's mouth here, but we could see a sentimental side to George, especially with Melissa's story about the cat. But George was also very nostalgic about and very much in love with Gracie, I think, all the way to the last day of his life. Did you ever go with George to the cemetery when he would visit Gracie's mausoleum? Were you ever privy to that?
One time I went, and you just left him alone, and he sat on there was a marble bench. He sat there, and he would talk to her and tell her different things that he was doing. And he always called her Googie, because that was his name for her. And I think anybody that knows George and has read his books and knows the story of how she got the name.
One night, Gracie couldn't get to sleep, and she
That's right.
over, and she said, "George, make me laugh." And I couldn't think of anything. I didn't have my writers then. All I could think of was Googie, Googie, Googie. She laughed hard, fell asleep. So from that day on, she was Googie to me.
She was Googie. And then when he got done, he would walk up to the vault, the marble, her name was, and there were 2 vases for flowers, and he would do that, and then he would kiss both sides, like either side of her name, and then that was it.
Wow.
It was a very just quiet moment, just between a husband and a wife, and a grieving widower talking to his deceased wife, and it was very sweet. He was very sweet.
Well, it was memorialized.
Sweet man.
That ritual, if you want to call it that, was memorialized in the 60 Minutes piece that was done on George.
Yes.
They took the video camera with him to the cemetery.
Right.
In addition to that, you played a Burns and Allen cassette for George. You want to You remember that story?
Oh, I do. I was very excited. Lisa just texted me. She said that was really fun, and I'm really glad I did it. Thank you.
Oh, that's great. I wanted it to be a positive experience
Yeah,
for her.
she had a wonderful time. That was
Great,
that.
great.
She had
I'm
a
so
great time. What did you ask me?
the Burns and Allen cassette.
Oh, yes. In the late 70s, early 80s, a lot of the old radio shows were becoming very popular, and they were putting them out on cassette tapes and marketing them. Jack Benny and the Bickersons and Burns and Allen and Fibber McGee, and I had found a Burns and Allen.
Cracker Barrel was selling.
Yeah.
them.
Okay. And I picked up a Burns and Allen, and I thought, well, I'll take it when I go to the office. I'll take it and play it. And we had a cassette recorder in the office, and in fact, I have that cassette recorder here in my closet. He used it in a Robovac commercial, and I have that recorder. But anyway, I said I found this tape of you and Gracie, a Burns and Allen show. He said, "Well, put it in." So we put it in, and it started to play. I don't remember. I may even still have the tape. I don't know, but I don't remember what the show was. But it started to play. Maxwell House Coffee Time with George Burns and Gracie Allen. And the show started, and they started talking, and they went back and forth, and the audience is laughing. And he put his head down a little bit, like he was listening. And then he looked up at me. He says, "Kid, could you turn that off?" I said, "Sure." So I went over and clicked the button. He says, I don't know why. He says, "It made me sad." I said, "Oh, George, I'm so sorry." He says, "Oh, it's all right." But it triggered something there, that just a memory of something. I don't know what. And I didn't ask. It wasn't any of my business. I felt bad enough that it made him sad.
Well, I understand.
And I didn't want to compound it by, digging deeper and asking why. It wasn't any of my business. So that was the end of playing Burns and Allen tapes in the office.
I think you were also with him, were you not, when he taped one of his television specials, and somebody found his old partner.
Oh, Billy Lorraine.
I used to do an act called Burns and Lorraine. I was Burns.
Yeah.
And,
yes.
I had to change my name every week because nobody would book me twice.
That's
anyway,
right.
Somebody found Billy Lorraine, and that was who, according to George, and I stand to be corrected here, but that was who George was working with when he met Gracie.
Yes, that was
a young actress came backstage, and she, for some reason, thought I was Billy Lorraine, and she was looking for a new partner, and so I was surprised. Anyway,
yeah,
that's the whole story. But somebody, when he was doing this TV special, found Billy Lorraine and brought him to the studio.
Yes, he was in the
audience. What happened?
He was in the audience, and it was a planned song, but it did something during the show that nobody had anticipated. Billy comes up, and Billy stuttered when he spoke, but he didn't stutter when he sang. But he did just fine during the show. And because George has told that story about when he and Billy were together in vaudeville, and Billy came in and was all excited, and he stuttered and he stammered and he stuttered and he stuttered. And George finally said, "Billy, sing it." He said, "We were just robbed," and they had been robbed. And anyway, so Billy's going to sing "Seems Like Old Times" on this. It was the Christmas show. It was the early Christmas special with the Playboy Playmates and Bob Hope and Anne Margaret, who was fabulous, and Hans Conried, who was brilliant as Scrooge. He was absolutely fabulous.
Perfect. Yeah.
And the Hawkins family, they were marvelous and did a great bit with George. So Billy starts to sing "Seems Like Old Time." George straightens his tie a little bit. He says, "Do I look all right?" And George straightened his tie a little bit. He said, "Yeah, you look fine." And he started to sing. And they had 3 cameras, and they had a master, and then they had a single on George and a single on Billy. And it cut to George. And in this sort of mask, that comedian's mask, it fell away. and you could see memories flooding back, and his whole expression changed. And then they had cut to the audience for different shots just later on to edit. And they cut to this little girl. Well, it turned out the little girl was Billy's granddaughter. And she was starting to cry because there was her grandfather up there with George Burns and singing on stage. And it was, I have goosebumps. I have a long sleeve shirt. I have goosebumps right now remembering that. And even to this day, if I watch the tape, I get that. And you see him change from, George Burns, with the cigar, to this man who just loved show business and remembered that far back 60 some years. And it was just a beautiful, beautiful moment. And like Lisa said, that was that soft side that you didn't always see on stage, but there it was without him saying a word.
And I think, Robert, it would be safe to say that probably one of the greatest show business friendships in history was between George Burns and Jack Benny.
Without a doubt. 55 years.
It's legendary stuff.
Right.
We talk about great Hollywood marriages. Certainly George and Gracie qualified, Jack and Mary, Jimmy Stewart and Gloria.
And Gloria, yes.
There's a lot of, famous Hollywood marriages, but George and Jack were almost as legendary as that. Did George ever talk about Jack to you? Do you have any memories or recollections of anything?
Not personal things, but he would mention Jack once in a while if he was working on a book and that kind of thing. And of course, he always loved to tell the stories, and it didn't take much to get him going to tell a Jack Benny story. And we've all heard them, we've all read them. I know Sean Doherty, I know he's on, and we all know the wonderful stories, the lint on the lapel at the party.
Right.
And those. I think my favorite though is there's two. There's the cigarette bit.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, where they're at the party. Yeah, they're at the party and there's a glass, because they had the cigarettes in a glass, because it was very classy, and the matches in another glass. And Jack took a cigarette out and put it in his mouth and took out a match. And George says, "Quiet, everybody. Jack Benny's going to do his famous cigarette bit." And Jack stood there, no clue, cigarette in one hand, match in the other. Stood there, it seemed like for an eternity, stuck the cigarette in his mouth and lit it. And George says, "Oh, a new finish." And Jack was gone. And of course, the other one is the party's not moving.
Oh yeah.
I think everybody can recite that one.
With Jack and Mary.
With Jack, yeah, the party's not moving. Yes, the party's moving. They're talking, they're drinking. He says, "I'll tell you what, I'm in show business too. The party's not moving." And George says, "Tell you what, you go upstairs, take off your pants, come down in your shorts with Mary's hat on your head and playing the violin." He says, "Do you think that'll work?" He says, "Absolutely." Jack goes upstairs. George gets everybody's attention in the room. Says, "Jack's going to come down in his shorts, wearing Mary's hat and playing the violin. Don't pay any attention to him." And Jack came down, that very outfit on, playing the violin. Once he realized he'd been had, he just broke up, looked at George and said, "Now the party's moving."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Do you remember the story when they were in the hotel? I think it was in Vegas, and Jack was going to try to get George back. So he told.
Now, is
George,
that the bacon and eggs, or is that the naked?
The naked.
Okay.
Yeah.
You tell it better. You tell that better.
Well, Jack was trying to find a way to pay George back for all of these pranks and gags that George had played on him over the years. So they were in a hotel, and I think it was in Las Vegas, and they were both there at the same time, of course. And so Jack said, "George, come up to my room in a few minutes. I want to talk to you." So Jack went on ahead to the room and stripped absolutely buck naked, absolutely not a stitch of clothes on. And Jack is standing on the bed playing the violin. And George knew that something was up.
Sure.
So he found the maid for that floor, and he said, I need you to go in and check on this man. He's in this room. So the maid walks in, and she discovers Jack stark naked on the bed playing the violin, and George got him again.
Yep.
That's one of my favorite stories.
I love those. There was one.
well,
there was
listen,
one too about bacon and eggs too. I think, but I don't remember.
Oh, well, tell that one. You tell that one.
Well, they I can't remember how it goes now. George ordered bacon and eggs, and
No,
then,
Jack said, George says, what do you want for?
oh no, that's a different. I know, but that's at the Brown Derby. I know that one. Yeah.
Okay, I'll tell Mary you had that.
I'll tell
okay,
Mary you
I
had
want
bacon and
yours,
you
but-
pay the check, or I'll tell Mary you had bacon and eggs. No, this is one where George would order something, or Jack would order something, and it wound up being you forgot to send up the ketchup. Anyway, if we knew it better, we could tell it better.
Well, let's jump into this one, because I think this is something that probably most people don't know, and that is the movie Grumpy Old Men with Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon. There's a story that is not well known, Robert. Why don't you impart that to us?
Well, the script came to the office in about 92, I think, somewhere in that neighborhood. So George was already 95, 96. And still wonderful, still sharp as a tack. And they wanted him for the grandfather part. And it was intended to be also sort of a mini Sunshine Boys reunion, even though he would be playing Jack Lemmon's father. But he would still have a couple of scenes with Walter. Well, it was going to be shot in Minnesota and in the winter. And Irving Fine got involved. And by the time Irving had convinced George that it was going to be too cold, and I don't know whether Irving thought it was going to be too cold for George or too cold for Irving, because Irving would have to be there too. They turned it down. And Burgess Meredith wound up wonderfully playing the grandfather. I mean, he was excellent in the part, but it would have been wonderful to see George play that character, because other than the God Pictures and Just You and Me Kid, other than this
Going places or going in style.
Going in style would have been along that same line, that character, because he wouldn't have been wearing the glasses and smoking the cigar, and it would have been a whole different persona for him. And because Jack Langdon, George's office manager, would say when he'd hear George rehearse in the motorhome on during a movie, he says, and George would leave to go to the set, and he says, boy, he can really read a line. And he could. I mean, that was his life. He knew that.
George and Jack shared one particular attribute, I guess is the best word I can come up with. They both were tremendous editors of material.
Yes, they were.
Jack, it's almost legendary that Jack would look at a script and say, no, that line belongs to Dennis, or that line belongs to Rochester, or whatever.
Right.
Give it away to somebody else. His name was on the show, so it didn't matter to him, but he could edit, and he could say, this character should do that bit, or whatever, or shorten that line, and the gag goes here. George was notorious for in vaudeville, at least, and I think all through his career, for standing in the wings and watching every other act on the bill, every show. He would not lock himself in the dressing room like some performers and turn the water on because he didn't want to hear anybody else getting applause.
Right.
George would stand in the wings and watch every act, and he would, in his mind, he would dissect the act, and he would try to figure out how to make it better. And he'd say, that third joke really should be first, and your fifth joke should be the last joke, or whatever. And he could do that and edit the material. And of course, he wrote all the stuff for he and Gracie, once
Well, he wrote
discovered-
the shorts, the early shorts. If you read the credits, it always says story by George N. Burns.
Yes, and and I just went right out of my head the name of the first one that they did.
Lamb chops.
Lamb chops. Thank you, lamb chop. But George was brilliant in the fact that he could. Well, the first. Does anybody remember that? Let me tell this story real quick, and then I'll open the floor. The very first booking that they got, George had to put something together really quick for he and Gracie for this first booking. And in vaudeville, there was the Dumb Dora sketch.
Correct.
That was pretty standard in vaudeville. It was the comedian with the spinning tie and the baggy pants, and the broad would come out by the lamppost and chewing gum and swinging the purse and whatever. And she would do the straight lines, and the comic would get the laugh.
Right.
Well, so they put that together for he and Gracie to go out and get something going, this Dumb Dora sketch. Well, Gracie walked out on stage and she was getting all the laughs with the straight lines.
Right.
And George was getting nothing with the gag lines. Well, a lot of comedians, their ego would have said, we're going to jam it until it works,
Right.
But George was bright enough to go in the dressing room and say, wait a minute, we've struck gold here. We got lightning in a bottle. And he rewrote the sketch so that Gracie would get laughs and he became the straight man. And
he was very intuitive that way.
Exactly. And he could figure that out. Real quick, I just, and I've told this story before, and if I get through it.
Okay.
George changed my life. I was on a cruise ship with a friend of mine, not as a performer, but just as a guest. And we were in Juneau, Alaska, and we ran into Fred Travellina. And Fred Travellina was one of the great impressionists of the 70s and 80s, and worked with the Rat Pack and worked with George and worked with the Reagan White House. And he was very, very popular. And he was now working cruise ships. And we ran into him in the hotel lobby in Juneau, Alaska. His ship was docked and the ship I was on was docked, and we spent the day. Anyway, I went over and I asked Fred, I said, let me buy you a drink, because I'd like to talk to you. And he said, oh, sit down, I'll buy you a drink. So that led to a 4-hour conversation. Mm-hmm. And we shared war stories and show business stories and all that sort of thing. And at one point he talked about working with George at a gig somewhere. And George, as was his habit, was in the wings watching Fred Travellina work. And when Fred came off stage, George asked him a question. He said, kid, let me ask you, what do you represent when you walk on stage? And Fred said, well, I represent myself. And he said, no, kid, you don't understand. He said, I know what I represent to my audience when I walk on stage. And if you give people what they want, they'll make you a star.
Right.
And he told me that, Fred Travellina told me that story. And it was as if George was speaking to me through Fred Travellina.
Right.
And Fred told me that it changed his life because he had to go back and re-examine everything he was doing as a performer and answer that question. And it was that moment that set in motion my putting together the Great Comedian Show, because I had been doing magic for 25 years. And that question that George asked, what do you represent when you walk on stage, finally clarified for me what I wanted to do and what I wanted to be. And so I love George because of that.
I understand.
My life. And I got to travel the world. I got to go around the world. I appeared at the London Palladium. I did all of that because of George Burns.
Yeah.
All of that because of George. Anyway, I'm sorry to be emotional about it.
No, it's perfectly all right.
It really gets to me. Anyway, you have a funny story about he did a Brentwood savings commercial.
Yes.
And we're talking about George the editor and George the person who could critique and find the best way to present something. Here's a great example, I think.
Yes, we were doing a commercial. George did a series of commercials in the very early 80s for a bank that is no longer around, called Brentwood Savings. They were the commercials were very popular. And this particular one was done, the set was done as a vaudeville dressing room back in the day. I mean, it was right out of like the Sunshine Boys with the old pictures and everything. And the director, it was done through his own outfit. The gentleman's name, well, I think he's passed away now. His name was Reed Miles.
Reed Miles.
R-E-I-D, Reed Miles. You can probably Google him, I'm sure. I don't know. Anyway, he was the director, and we're in this dressing room set, and there's a seal involved in this commercial. Now, you don't see the seal. George is talking to someone, and you think it's just a person. And finally, I think a kid pops the door open and says, Mr. Burns, you're on. He says, okay, kid. And he says, thanks. He says, okay, kid, we're on. And it cuts to the seal. Well, during the rehearsal, Reed Miles had it on a real wide shot. So you could see the dressing room, you could see George, you could see the seal. He's talking to the seal, you can see the seal. So the joke is already blown because now you know who George is talking to. And George says, we can't do it in a master. It's got to be a single cut to the seal. When I said, we're on, kid. And they got into this huge argument. And Reed Miles, he was probably 6'3", 6'4", a very big man. And George was 5'8", 5'9". He was not very tall. And so they're like this. And George is like a little bulldog, which I had not seen. And he knew what was right for the scene, for the commercial, to make the joke work. And he won. He flat won the argument, and Reed Miles backed down. Part of the reason there was yelling was because Mr. Miles was hard of hearing and did not wear hearing aid. So apparently George felt the need to make sure he was heard, and he was definitely heard. So when you can find that commercial, I believe, on YouTube. And
I think you can.
And
yes.
when you see it, it cuts to the seal. Well, that's courtesy of George. And
Absolutely.
I don't know if it's in your notes, or I don't, because you're the director, as Walter would, as Willie would say, you're the director. The story about George, talking about George editing.
Yes.
He and I in the office with the Bob Hope.
With Bob.
When they were doing Madison Square Garden.
Oh, go. Yes, please tell.
Did you want to do that? If you've got something else, that's fine.
No. Please tell that story. We
were talking about editing, and that came to mind.
Yeah. Because Jack and George both had that. Both of them had that unique ability and that quality that they knew where the gag was. The only other person I can think of that was of that caliber was Buster Keaton, because Buster knew exactly how to cut the film so that you got the gag and you knew where the gag was. Right. And he would argue with the writers and the directors. He's no, you got to show this first, then come to me, and then cut back, and that's where the gag is.
Correct.
And Buster knew this, intensely, the way that Jack and George were also of that caliber. So go ahead, talk about Bob Hope. We haven't talked about Bob much.
And George and Bob were doing a show or a set of shows at Madison Square Garden in, I think, around 89, I think. And George had to cut 3 minutes out of his nightclub routine, his regular act. So he and Bob at the end could do a Burns and Allen routine. Bob would put on a lady's hat, and they would do
another one doing Another
one doing Gracie. In fact, before I start that story, I found this picture in the files, and it's
Oh, wow.
with Jack it's at a benefit, because it's not the one when they did on Jack's show. This is because it's a different hat and hair, I think.
Yeah.
I think this one wound up in the Living It Up book.
Oh, okay. I
but
know
anyway.
I've seen it before. Yeah.
Anyway, so he and Bob were going to do the Burns and Allen routines, and they needed 3 minutes cut out of George's act. So he and I are in the office, and he has me get a legal pad and the stopwatch, and I still have that stopwatch, and I wish I brought it. It's upstairs on my dresser. I don't let it wander too far.
Yes.
Wish I brought it down for this. Anyway, it's just a stopwatch, but it's a special stopwatch. And he explained to me what we were going to do. And he sat in a red director's chair in his office next to his desk. He only sat at the desk when he was either autographing pictures or signing checks, which was sometimes very painful to sign checks, because that meant the money was going out instead of coming in. But anyway, so he's sitting in the chair. So he tells me he's going to do his act, but we need to cut 3 minutes. So he says, start the watch, keep track on the legal pad of what I tell you. So he starts to do his whole act right there, sitting there. He doesn't sing the songs completely through, but and I'm timing. I start the watch. He says, okay, we're going to cut the nudity routine. He had a thing about nudity in movies. And he says, and so he does that, and I time it. I stop the watch. I write down the time, how long that took. And he cut something else out and something else out. And finally, I'm writing it down. I add up the time. He stopped. He did the whole bit. He looked at me. He says, well, and I said, 3 minutes on the money. He looked at me. It was on the money. He looked at me, smiled. He said, how about that? Exactly what to take out and how long those bits ran to get 3 minutes. But it was just, we needed confirmation. And I mean, it was right on 3 minutes.
Absolutely.
It was,
well, Robert, we're kind of getting close to out of time here, and I want to throw the floor open if there's anybody that's got a question for you. Is how would you like to wrap this up? What would you want us to know about George and or maybe Jack that your impression or your particular viewpoint of those two gentlemen are, having worked so closely with George?
Well, I can't speak on Jack other than what I've seen him do with George on films, on TV shows and things like that, because I came after Jack had passed.
Sure.
I didn't know Jack personally like Lisa did. And but George, like you, changed my life. That morning, I guess, at the breakfast table with the coffee, and 17 years of pure enjoyment with that man. He was just a dear, sweet man who loved what he did for his living. You know, he would always have his standard line of, he'd rather be a failure in show business than a success making felt hats.
Yeah.
and it was, he loved it. He didn't believe in vacations. He didn't like vacations. Why take a vacation from something that you love? You know, and I admired that. And a lot of us have jobs that, you know, we feel are drudgery and that kind of thing. And George didn't have that. Even before Gracie, you know, he would tell stories and write about them. How even though he was a failure, he still loved it. He still loved show business. And to love something like that for 87 years, he's 107, 93 years.
93 years, yeah.
93 years from the Pee Wee Quartet to March 9th of 1996. He loved what he did. And I always admired him for that. And I admired him for allowing me into his life. This kid from Michigan who had moved to California, And just by happenstance, we met and it just clicked. And I am forever grateful. And I dine out on those memories daily.
Well, and there was also during George's last decade, he had promised everyone that he was going to live to be 100.
Right.
And
he did.
There were two things that were happening simultaneously. One was George promising everyone that he was going to live to be 100.
Right.
And we were all rooting for him because everybody loved George. I can't imagine anybody that didn't love George. And you
Right.
rooted for him. And he said it with such conviction that you believed he was going to do it. You know, he says, I can't die, I'm booked. And,
Right.
and you rooted for him. The other thing that was going on simultaneous with that was George Foreman, in his quest to become the oldest heavyweight boxing champion of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And those two gentlemen, George Foreman and George Burns, put the spotlight on quote unquote ageism and
Right.
our attitudes toward age. And I think they changed a lot of people's perceptions of what it meant to grow. You can't help getting older, but you don't have to get old.
And that's very true. And he lived by that credo. He lived.
That is the central line of my show, The Great Comedians. That's the central point at which everything else revolves.
Right. We saw his last show in Tahoe, and our youngest daughter, Catherine, who he had held as a baby, finally got to see him perform live on stage.
Oh, wow.
And I can remember looking over, watching her watch him with her mouth kind of open and in amazement. And he was letter perfect that night. I mean, he was my wife was there, Sheila, and my mom. And it was like God was good to him that night, just gave him the best show. And we went backstage, of course, later and we got a picture. And then a week later, he fell in the bathtub. And that precipitated his unfortunate retirement and, of course, the end. And in September of 95, Sheila and we had moved to Northern California by that point. And I went down to the office and to see him. And he was much frailer than he had been, but he still was sharp. And we took a picture, the three of us took a picture together. And as we went to say goodbye, I always kissed him on the cheek when I'd say goodbye. Always. Never shook his hand, would always give him a little kiss on the cheek. And he was sitting in his chair, in his director's chair, and I leaned down to kiss his cheek, and he turned his face to me and kissed me on the mouth. And I burst out crying. And I to this day, I think he was telling me, so long, kid. I think he kind of knew me by that point because he wasn't doing anything. He was going to the office when he could. And but he had essentially stopped performing. Irving got him to do one last commercial for Australian football. And it's on YouTube. I beg people not to watch it. He looks absolutely just awful in it. And I've only seen it once. I can't watch it more than once. It looks like we're going to have to go. So, but anyway, I love him. I miss him. And he's always in my heart.
Just a quick comment on that. Buddy Hackett had said after Jack died, Jack Benny isn't really dead. He's just hiding from Irving Fine. And I'm sure you of all people can appreciate that line. Oh yeah.
Yes, I certainly can. Yes,
Robert,
I certainly can.
Well,
Robert,
let me jump in here and just say, Robert, you are always a delight. It's incredible the generosity with which you share these stories, and we both love George, and as Melissa
Yes.
did.
Oh,
And this has been
absolutely.
terrific. And if anybody has a question or so, it looks like we have maybe 2 or 3 minutes left before the end of the segment. So,
Yep.
Jack, I'll give it back to you if there's anybody that has something they'd like to add.
And
Thank
Brad,
you,
Brad,
for being-
Zach, yeah, thank you, Brad. Real quick, I found this today in the files, and it is the copy, and it says for March 9th, 1952 Benny Show, and it's the George and Gracie Routine.
Wow.
All right. So what I'd like to do is I'm gonna send you a copy, Zach. I think if I scan it,
Yes. If
scan
you
it,
scan
and we email it, and then we can just share it. You can just share it with everybody.
we can absolutely.
But I've got a copy for Brad.
Yeah, if you wanna, if I will shoot you an email here in a second when we move over to the next panel, we will absolutely show that to everybody here.
Okay,
That
great.
is a blessed gift, and I want to tell you, we do have a couple of questions,
Sure.
but I wanted to. This is a gift that I got from Kathy Fuller Seeley as a stretch goal towards my own book writing venture on Jack's film career. This
Yes.
film makes me cry every time, and it's
Yes.
because of these two sitting with each other. Well, Willie's in bed, but these two next to each other, like they come to a conclusion about their lives in show business, and then the camera pulls back and you just see them bickering. And I don't
Yes.
think there's another shot of George in acting that exemplifies how great he was at letting others do the work, do the talking for him, or letting the camera do the work for him too. But there's a shot when he's waiting outside of the hospital in the lobby, and Herbert Ross pulls
Yes,
back.
with his hat in his hand.
There's a thought that Jack would have like won the Oscar if he had been in the Sunshine Boys, and I'm like, perhaps, but we have George here, and I will tell you that there is nothing more striking than watching the world's greatest straight man just knock it out of the park as one of the best directors or one of the best actors that we've ever had.
Yes, I agree. I
It's
totally agree.
remarkable.
Yeah, I have a Sunshine Boys one sheet in here in our room there. It's the Academy Award winner version.
Yeah, it's
wonderful.
that movie. If anybody here hasn't seen the Sunshine Boys, watch it. It will make you
Yes,
laugh.
please.
It will make you cry. It will make you ask for a bag of Frumpy's potato chips.
Yes, it will. And it's Frumpies. And Brad, I'm sorry, what size shirt Sheila's asking?
Oh, large.
Large. Okay, very good.
Large.
And we have some questions. And answer these in your own comfort too, Robert. But Bill wants to know, did you ever meet Ronnie, or did Ronnie visit with his dad frequently?
Yes, I met Ronnie.
Okay.
He didn't visit with his father. Not that I'm aware. He may have come to the house. I'm sure it was to get money. I don't mean to speak ill of the dead. I am not a fan of Ronnie Burns, for the record.
Mm-hmm.
He was very, very nasty to Jack Langdon after George passed, after 36 years of service to George in the office. And Ronnie's goal in life was to make money, and didn't care where it came from. Sorry, I know he was a teenage heartthrob or whatever he was back in the Burns and Allen days, but that isn't how it turned out.
Right. No, I totally
Sorry,
understand.
I probably should have put a filter on that, but when Ronnie's name comes up, that's what happens.
No, totally understandable, and I appreciate you
Sandy-
speaking within your comfort.
And Sandy, on the other hand, was a lovely lady,
Mhm.
a sweet lady, and doll. But unfortunately, Ronnie was the not.
Right. I totally understand. But thank you for sharing that within your comfort zones. I
Sure.
appreciate that, Robert. And then Steve Garland wants to know, question for Robert. Is the early George Burns Xmas special you mentioned where Billy Lorraine is the guest, do you know if that's available anywhere?
For a while, it was, well, they came out with a 4 or 5. There were several specials they had put on a DVD set. And I don't know the company, but they're still available. I think you go to Amazon, you can find it. George Burns TV specials or something it's called. And it's got the early Christmas special, George Burns and Other Sex Symbols, How to Live to Be 100 or More. all those he did for NBC, and also the CBS specials are there. The 100th birthday when he was 83. The George Burns special with Walter, and Lisa's in that special, by the way. She plays, you'll see her as a nurse at the beginning of the special. And they were on YouTube for a while, but I'm assuming that whoever is selling the videos pulled them.
Oh, I got you.
I don't know if you can just see a clip of it now, or whether you have to now buy the DVDs.
Gotcha. Well, that's good to know. We can be on the lookout for that.
Okay.
And then, Brad, did you have something?
I just real quick before we break out of this panel, I just want to give everybody a heads up. Later this evening is Greg Oppenheimer's recreation coming up, which is the Jack Benny Buy Shoelaces for Don Wilson for Christmas episode recreation, and that's been talked about several times. I heard that mentioned the Christmas episodes, and that's coming up a little bit later this evening. So stay tuned, folks. Don't go away. And if you remember, Leonard Maltin talked about getting an autograph or a letter from Mel Blanc. Just real quick, when I was 5 years old, my mother took me to see Mel Blanc at a shopping center here in Phoenix, and I got to meet him. I was only 5, but I got his autograph afterwards, and it's on the blue stationery that
Outstanding.
Leonard Maltin had referenced, and you can see there, that's his signature there at the bottom, but that's the blue paper. I've had all of my life for 60 years, this autograph. And also I have an autograph of Dennis Day. That was Alice was my grandmother. I had him sign this to my grandmother. And my brother-in-law in Vegas, my brother-in-law in Vegas ran into Jack Benny in the hotel somewhere, and I have a personal autograph of Jack Benny.
That's outstanding.
Brad,
my
look
God.
at that because of my brother-in-law. So I got Mel and Dennis and Jack, but I don't have anybody else's autograph, but I'm very proud to have those.
I'm extremely entranced by that autograph from Glockamora you received there, Brad. Wonderful. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking a minute away from Jack to focus on one of his best friends, if not his best friend. Let's face it, it is his best friend, George Burns.
Yes, indeed.
Robert, thank you so much for your stories. Melissa,
it's my pleasure.
Yeah, and Melissa, we know she's already logged off, but a thank you out here if you find yourself watching this panel over again. Talking about George is one of the greatest parts of Benny fandom. Is we get a bonus comedian.
George called Jack the Quiet Riot.
The Quiet Riot.
The Quiet Riot, and he adored Jack.
Yeah, and by the way, guys. We talked about Shout Factory earlier. The Oh God trilogy, the superior trilogy out there in filmland. Sorry, Star Wars. The Oh God trilogy is available on Blu-ray with new bonus features from Shout Select. So if you want a HD version of it, head on over to Shout. They're not paying me to say this.
and Lisa is credited as one of the writers on Oh God Book 2.
There you go. So we've got
Melissa Miller.
We've got some incentive for y'all to go out there and recheck out one of the best films Carl Reiner ever directed and 2 lovely sequels.